thank you guys for everybody being here. I really want to encourage folks that you can use the chat screen, that if you click on the chat button at the bottom of the Zoom call, it will show up on the side. I'm more than happy to answer questions throughout. We can wait towards the end. This is really more designed to be a conversation than it is a lecture. I do have sort of an outline, a presentation, but I'm not really going to show it. I think everyone may be just tired of looking at slides. And so what I would do, and I've done this before, is I'm more than happy to get a PDF version of that to Adrian, and then he, through whatever mechanisms, can make it available to anybody that would, maybe see it being a benefit. I also will have a couple of checklists that I'll also send Adrian's way. If you have any questions or concerns, whether or not your kid, you might be struggling a little bit with some anxiety or depression or something that maybe starts to meet more of a concerning criteria rather than just, just having ups and downs, certainly want everybody to have that education and resource available. So I've spoken here before. I'm Jonathan Hetterly. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor many, many years ago, before a pandemic, and I thank God for this every day. I was a youth pastor. So I got to be a youth pastor when you could actually have people cough on each other and bob for apples and sleep at Valley Cruise. We've been to Valley Cruise. We've been, Sun Servants, did all of that. I've taken kids up to Windy Gap. But I got out of it knowing that in 18 years, there was going to be a pandemic and that it would make youth ministry that much more difficult. So now I'm trying to do mental health therapy through remote services. This is actually a presentation. A lot of this is going to be something that I even shared with a company, a business out of Atlanta with about 300 employees. And I gave this same talk and conversation. I took out some of the stuff that was more related to adults, but essentially there is no demographic in America right now that is not being significantly impacted by these kinds of uncertainty, pandemic, or just transition. So many things we are not used to have suddenly changed, and we're all sort of left adjusting. In the mental health community, there is a clinical diagnosis known as adjustment disorder. And what it is, it's really when you go through great change. And, hello. But adjustment disorder is when you go through a period of adjustment and change, and it takes you a while to really kind of transition well, sort of get enough sort of familiarity, routine. So a lot of times how you cope, how you react to things, you feel a little bit more in control and familiar with that situation. And that's usually something we see when somebody maybe goes off to college or moves for the first time, gets a job, gets married, loses their job. But in a lot of ways, we could argue that the entire world has been in for half of a year in a clinical diagnosis of adjustment disorder, because we are in times of great uncertainty. And in a lot of ways, we are in this constant state of waiting to get clarity. But even when we get more information, we have to juggle how much does our optimism allow us to really connect with hope, and how much do we temper that enthusiasm because we don't want to be gravely disappointed, knowing that there's so many things right now that are just outside of our control. There's so many things that we cannot predict. We are all doing our best to make educated guesses. And yet we as human beings, we find safety and security in knowledge, in predictability, because that's a form of control. That allows us to anticipate, okay, what is life going to be like and how can I prepare or respond? We've all been thrown out of that kind of, that sort of path here since March or April. And so what we're going to talk a little bit here today is we're going to talk about what's going on with teens, what we're seeing with teens, what are they stressed about, and what can we do? And then I'm really going to save a lot of time for folks just to ask specific questions or comments about either what I talk about or bringing to light something that you've observed or you worry about your own teens, your own kids, or just kids in your faith community. It's interesting that there was actually some data that came out here recently just talking about the biggest impact that this pandemic and times of uncertainty are having with our young folks. And they really divided it up into sort of three demographics. They had children, they had teenagers, then they had adults, young adults and 20-somethings. The young kids, what they really reported that they were tremendously stressed and worried about was friendships, just friends, because of that social disconnect. Young adults, they were most worried about jobs and their future. Teenagers, the number one thing they reported worrying about and stressed about was their mental health. And this has actually been consistent for about the last 7 or 8 years, that mental health has become the number one stressor for young people. Did you know that the number one reason college students drop out of college is a mental health crisis? Did you know that 73% of college students at one point during their college experience will experience a severe mental health crisis? We've done a really great job in the last few decades normalizing mental health awareness, breaking down the stigma, helping this generation be open and talking about it. But one of the things is they are very hyper aware of it, and they are very concerned about what's going on in the world and what impact it may have on them. And so let's talk about what this is having as an impact on not just our young people, but we as a family, because we've become sardines where we're all encased in this same quarantine space. And I hate sardines. So the idea of that just is the perfect illustration of what a lot of people are experiencing right now. Let's talk about really this idea of simultaneously being hyper aroused, hyper alert, and fatigued at the same time. So you have all this energy and you feel this constant fatigue. So let's first talk about what our teens and young folks have experienced that's increased. Here's all the things that have increased over the last 6 months. They've actually had more time. They've had more available time. But they've also had a great increase of uncertainty. What were their plans for the rest of the school year? What was their plans for the summer? What's the plan for the fall? Sports, extracurricular activities. Both of my daughters who are in high school, they do choir. You can't do traditional choir during a global pandemic. So instead, they're doing choir where there's 15 or 20 people in a class, and they've taken over the worship center in their school to where they're spread out by 10, 15 feet, and they're all wearing masks. That's definitely a different way of doing choir. So uncertainty, that's the other thing that has changed. Change, everything is changing. Now, I don't know about you all, and I certainly don't know about your kids, but I love change. I have a daughter that probably is like me, thrives with change. And then I have a wife and a daughter that they hate change. It just gets to them. They want things to be certain. They want things to be predictable. They want things to be safe. I'm the kind of guy that probably, we joke around, I probably have an underdeveloped amygdala. I probably don't stress about things as much as I should. But, God was very gracious. He brought me a wife who probably worries more than she should. So we really complement each other well. So much things have changed. Because of that, we're in a constant state of active thinking. We can't just coast in life. Your teens can't coast in life. They have to constantly be thinking about new things because it's new. When they would go to their schools, when they maybe even go to youth group, I certainly know as a kid that grew up going to church, this was true during Sunday mornings, you kind of just coast and you're not even really thinking, right? You just have that muscle memory in that habit. But now because that's been stripped away, so much of our daily life, there is this active thinking. One thing that's increased, possibilities. There's all these great possibilities, even though there are limitations. So now let's talk about what's decreased. So we have all these things that have increased, all these things now that decreased. Really knowledge. I mean, we are experts in so many things, and this has really created a state of a lot of educated guessing, a lot of speculation. Another thing that's greatly decreased is our sense of control. Our sense of control, which is huge for mental health struggles, because we tend to cope in not so great ways when we feel out of control. We tend to overcompensate or react. External reinforcement, big thing that was lost the last half of the spring semester and the summer. Um, a lot of people didn't have a time that they needed to get up to be at school. And so you saw all these things. They didn't have a scheduled lunchtime. So you start to see young people that they don't have these habits, and they maybe start decreasing things because there's not a lot of external reinforcement. A lot of these things now, if it's going to happen, it's either going to be from their own intrinsic motivation, which a lot of teens struggle with, or it comes from external reinforcements from their parents, which tends to create a lot of tension and hostility in the home life. One huge thing that got decreased was just space. I do a lot of family and marital therapy, and a lot of times we would use space as one of the ways to kind of cope when things would escalate. Well, what do you do when you're not supposed to be going out in the community? What are you doing when everybody is working together under the same roof, doing school under the same roof? And then when the day is over, you have such limited outlets and places to go, which we saw a tremendous decrease in coping outlets. Even folks without mental health struggles, the idea of going for a walk, the idea of going to a concert or a movie or going to a nice restaurant, meeting up with friends at Chick-fil-A or Starbucks, so much of that has been greatly disrupted. And even when you're able to go, again, you're having to be very active in your thinking about following with all the social distancing protocols, and you tend to be very aware nowadays of what other people are and aren't doing. And one of the biggest things we've seen decrease with everybody, this is not teens, I'm talking to the people here, is our frustration tolerance. We've seen little things feel like big things. We feel like big things are catastrophic things. And so we all just sort of are like that child in the Willy Wonka movies that's just blowing up like a giant blueberry. It's just all of that tension and irritability and frustration. Let's talk about other things that have increased. Time with family, and yet also time alone. Everybody's stressed and everybody's bored, right? Another thing that's increased is when everybody's together is parents have a way of watching their kids more. That's just the law of inevitability. If your kid is around you more, you tend to observe what they are and are not doing more regularly. And if as a parent, you don't like what they're doing, then the law of average goes up that we're probably going to say something about it, which we know our teenagers love it when their parents want to talk to them, right? At some point during this pandemic, I'm a marriage and family therapist. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor. This is my job. And I will tell you right off the bat, I probably had one of the worst fights with my wife during this pandemic. And one of my daughters and I, we had to kind of take a point where we were sending texts and letters because we were just not able to communicate. Things would break down so quickly. And part of it was that, right, that frustration tolerance, observing other things. This is what happened with my wife. My wife has not changed who she is during this time, but I'm around her so much that the things that have always bothered me about her for the 21 years of our marriage, well, I'd go off to work. And then maybe I would be picking up one of our daughters at her choir practice, or her softball practice, or her play practice, or maybe I would actually go hang out with some colleagues after work. But instead, for 5 or 6 months, every day I walked 10 steps to the guest bedroom and I did my work, and then I'd go downstairs and have lunch, and then we'd see each other so often, and I'd see these things that have always kind of bugged me, but up until this point, I can tolerate it. But suddenly, because of this time of uncertainty and quarantine, now it's like the most irritating character flaw of my wife. And I eventually just kind of unloaded on her. And trust me, my wife's done that with me. My kids have done that with me. And I'm sure I have with them as well. So we're just living in this state of hyper awareness, observations, criticism. And part of that is also because some of the things that have decreased for all of us is time with friends, time with colleagues, physical contact and interaction with others. And one of the really interesting things that we're observing that's decreased because of this is empathy. Because when we struggle, when we hurt, and this is one of the biggest casualties of mental health, is when we are in such pain and disarray, it's really, really difficult to step out of that and try to connect with somebody else's struggles and challenges. And so if we see folks right now who are struggling on so many levels about this time of uncertainty during this pandemic, their empathy will go down, and that's really going to create a chain reaction of how they communicate, how they relate, how they criticize, and then we see sort of the back and forth that things can quickly escalate. So your teens and parents and your church and schools and our community, the effects of all this is we're living in a constant state of fear. There's this heightened state of arousal, which is what we call a chronic threat response. We're always kind of worried, right? Before this pandemic, we were already living in the age of anxiety. Our kids were anxious. They were reporting record levels of anxiety. Parents were anxious. We had kind of exaggerated a lot of the worries in the world through media and social media and wanting to build the most optimal, perfect life for our kids. And one of the things that we as mental health professionals are having to rewrite is, for the last several years, we've been saying, parents, calm down. There's not that much to worry about. And now we're in this state where it's like, well, there's a lot to worry about. And so even mental health professionals having to recognize and pivot, like, how do we deal with this chronic threat response to where it's not just what your teenager does that we're worried about, it's whatever environment they're in and what those people are or are not doing. That creates this domino effect, this ripple effect of our worry and fear. And then if we are struggling, we overcompensate where we try to create control with what we can't control, we can really limit life and we can be very, very rigid. This hyper-arousal survival mode, this is oftentimes what we call a trauma response, where you're in this constant state of threat, so you can't relax. And our sympathetic nervous system can only stay in that overwhelmed, almost frantic state for so long before we crash. And we're seeing a lot of people crash. We're seeing a lot of people just sleep and have very low energy. We're seeing them disconnect from their interests. You know, what are the consequences? Even though we can sleep more, we're getting poorer sleep. There's a lot of loss of interest and pleasure. Part of that is from the familiarity. Our brains are wired for novelty, stimulation. But what happens if the things that you enjoy, you can do it for 12 hours a day for 6 months? You kind of lose the joy of it. I always talk about that desensitization for teens. It's like, pick your favorite meal. Now imagine 12 days in a row, that's all you ate. By the 12th day, that is not going to be anywhere near as savory and enjoyable. Nothing's changed about that meal, but overexposure leads to desensitization and decrease of pleasure. We're seeing that with young people because so many things that they enjoy have been significantly limited, restricted, or they can't do anymore. And we see that loss of human connection and interaction. The number of people, even if it wasn't serious conversations, the number of people when they would go to school, the number of people when they could go to church or youth group, or they were in summer camps or summer jobs, that they would just interact with, even with nonverbals, because there's so much emotional currency that exchanges in the presence of others that they've lost for a significant number of months. We're going to see in the coming years how much we've had a social skills setback with this generation from this disconnect. And I'm really, really worried that it's going to be a huge epidemic because we were already seeing a lot of kids through social media and disconnecting with and video gaming, that they were already kind of losing that currency of being able to step into a crowd, know how to interact socially and not be overly self-conscious and worried. And now we've had 6 months where everything has really been primarily through technological means. We see boredom turns to numbness, and then numbness turns into depression. We see that physical and emotional exhaustion, which tends to lead to hopelessness, helplessness, and then what we've talked about already, we see those emotional outbursts, right? Because part of self-control is having a reserve of composure and energy. It's all about having enough in our battery that, like the illustration I gave with my wife and my own kids, is when my battery has enough power in it, those little things that bother me, they stay little things because I can utilize some of that composure and just say, like, let it go. You know, in 2 minutes, you're not going to be upset by that. In 2 minutes, you're going to move on. But when we have low frustration tolerance, we don't have that energy to keep ourselves composed, and we react. We emotionally react. I'm sure many of you have similar stories to me, that you've had several kind of emotional meltdowns or outbursts since this all began, regardless if it was externalized, so it was like loud and visible, or whether it was really internalized, where people were kind of crying and recognizing that they're numb and recognizing that they feel really lonely and scared and hopeless. But emotions, we are just doing we're in a really difficult time. Now, here's the thing. I gave my first talk with this. I've given about 4 talks since the pandemic. The first time I gave this was about a month and a half into it. And all of this still applies. There's still so much we don't know. There's still so much that is out of our control. What we realized is then we got to figure out a way to live in a healthy way in this ongoing time of uncertainty. We as human beings, as creatures, we love to be in an orchestra where you have all the notes and we know exactly what's going to happen, what we need to learn, what we need to do. And most of us now are transitioning into being jazz performers, where it's about improv. It's about staying on your toes, because a lot of what we would hopefully have as a foundation at any given moment would be stripped away. One of my clients, we spent the entire summer preparing them to go transfer to Chapel Hill. Well, guess what happened here? And next week he's moving back home, and we're going to have to deal with living back home with parents, which created a lot of challenges for everybody. Again, this new normal, which we don't know how long it's going to be the new normal before there's a newer normal and a newer normal. So what do? Well, I think the first thing that we need to do as parents, as adults, and then as role models for our kids and the young people in your community of faith is we just need to reset expectations. Because the more we hold to rigid expectations, the more that we really kind of yearn or long or grieve for the way things were in the past, it really limits us from adapting and transitioning to this just as the way that it is. In psychology and mental health, we call that radical acceptance. That ability to just accept that this is the world. This is the world as it is. You don't have to like it. You may wish for things in the past. You may hope for things in the future. But today, this is today. How do we make the best of it? When we struggle with acceptance, then we not only have to deal with the disconnect of how the world is, but then we increase our emotional turmoil because we are so fraught with grief and sadness. So when we apply radical acceptance, we hopefully can temper and contain that emotional turmoil and really learn to, okay, what do I need to do? And part of that then is focus on what you can control. Focus on what you can control versus getting lost, overwhelmed, frustrated about what we can't control. Because there's so much. Again, I recognize that we all cling to the things that we can control because that feels like safety. It's security. And right now, so many things are out of our control. We feel untethered. We are like a boat without an anchor, and the constant waves of what's going on in our world is just rocking us back and forth. So we need to reset expectations, focus on what we can control. And here's an interesting, and this is a nuance, but this has been really important. I've worked with young people, is we need to be intentional and not passive. And what I mean by that is this, is I've had guys, young guys, that just, what are you doing? Well, I'm playing video games and I'm napping. Well, why? Well, I don't know, nothing else to do. And so that's just sort of like, for them, it's like hygiene. It's just what happens. It's like a meal. If they don't have other plans, a lot of the guys I work with, that's what they default to. We see this with both young men and young women with social media. They just get online, and before you know it, They're just scrolling because there's nothing else to do. Now, like many things, things can be beneficial, things can also get to a point where they're benign, and then things can become problematic. But when we're passive in a lot of ways, we're not active living. We need to be active in our living. And even if someone chooses to take a nap, from a mindset standpoint, them making a very deliberate decision to take a nap is much different than there's nothing else to do, so why get out of bed? And then they just fall asleep. Because from what I observed working with young people is when they power down like that, it's really, really challenging to power them back up. We got to keep them active living. What does that mean? Well, as much as teens hate this, my daughters hate it. They see the value, they will participate, but they also recognize like this is the part of life that I hate, is we need schedules, we need structure. Structure is basically highways. They're like roads. They allow us to know what lane we need to stay in, because without it, it's chaos. Now, the thing that though we tend to benefit from is you make a schedule knowing that in times of uncertainty, probably 6 to 8 weeks later, you really want to diversify your schedule. You want to keep it enough to where it doesn't become so mundane and perfunctory that, again, it loses some of that novelty. So you focus on short, specific units of time. What I've been doing with my clients and their parents since this all started was, let's make a plan for the next month. Just make a plan for the next month. Don't focus on how long this will be, because the more you focus on an unknown future, you get overwhelmed, you start getting stressed, you get discouraged. Focus on September. What's September going to be like? Depending upon your teen, make it as collaborative as possible. Early on, we recognized that we were being too passive with our daughters, and their schedules really just went everywhere. And knowing that we all had to work together, I was working from home, that we needed some level of stability when it came to like how late they were up, how loud they were when I was working. So, we said, come up with a schedule and what you think is reasonable, knowing that we're in this really weird world. What everybody needs to do is practice self-compassion. This is hard. That's the antithesis, that's the antidote for that lack of criticism, or that lack of empathy, and that increase of criticism, is we need to practice self-compassion. As a parent, this is hard for me. The parent of 2 teenagers, this is really hard for them. Part of that resetting expectations is I've really had to work with a lot of parents that I don't know what the future looks like, but you got to let go. And you can't worry what this is going to mean for the rest of their life, and the college that they're going to get into, and when they're going to get out of college, and what the job market's going to look like, and what money they're going to make. That's usually when I say, let's just focus on the next month and realize this is really hard for everybody. Nobody wants this. Another thing that a lot of teens hate, but they recognize the value, is we need to stay active. We just need to stay active. If you took your teen and in April or May and looked at how many steps they were taking when they switched to online school, and you looked a year ago when they started school, just the amount of simple steps just going from class to class. I already talked about the number of touch points with other people. Imagine that, just that level of activity and movement that over time really catches up to you. That can make the smallest difference in somebody that's stressed and struggling, but they're able to pull it together at the end of the day, versus somebody that's not being particularly active, because activity is a great stress reliever. And it's help in terms of helping us identify sometimes where we're stressed. So we need to stay active, move around, and then ask for what you need. We can't assume we know what's going on with them, where they're struggling, what they need. So we need to ask for what we need, and we need to ask questions about how people are doing. I think it was early summer, I did a talk for Transformation Church on just depression and suicide. And I really kind of pushed for people. If you know someone that struggles with mental health, Don't wait for them to reach out. We are so already isolated and disconnected because of this. Reach out to them, ask how they're doing. When this pandemic happened, one of my clients at one point hadn't talked to a single person outside of his family for 3 weeks. He was going to school, but he wasn't talking to anybody because he's not a talker. So he's gonna clock into Zoom, but he's just gonna be there. For 3 weeks, he had no human interaction other than his family. If you know somebody like that, if your kid is like that, be very, very aware of how this, we talked about earlier, how they might be losing some of that social skill kind of boldness. So we talked about, reset expectations. Now let's talk about some specific things. These are some very specific therapeutic tools and tips. And I throw all of these out because the great thing about mental health and wellness is that there's so many things that can help. We just have to find the recipe that really connects with your young person. How their brain works, how their stress works, how much they rely on physical outlets, how they might focus more on internal cognitive outlets or creative, abstract, artistic outlets. But the great news is that there's a lot out there. A lot of times we have to try to find which one really connects with us. So the resetting expectations, now let's talk about some specific therapeutic tools. Mindfulness activities, right? Mindfulness is all about being fully present. And what right now is with that uncertainty, people are thinking about the future. It's so unknown. Thinking about the past, maybe the glory days. Today is where you have the most influence and ability to change and shape your life. So anything that can help your kids with mindfulness principles, there's so many apps out there that can help them. There's yoga, there's meditation, simply deep breathing can help people kind of calm themselves down, get back in touch with their senses, their environment. Then there's externalizing activities like journaling, writing, artistic expression, playing music. I had one client when we were brainstorming, because I would throw out there, we have all this time. What's something you've always wanted to do but you never had time for? And granted, this client maybe had socioeconomic means at his disposal that not everybody does. But he said, well, you know what I've always wanted to do? I always wanted to learn to play the violin. And I was like, well, talk to your parents about it. And sure enough, they got a violin. And he's been taking online violin lessons. Why? Because anything that would help somebody not just fixate and focus on how much has changed, how much they can't do, how miserable they are. And so tapping into that abstract artistic music arena was really important. I ordered from China, so it took 3 months, a musical instrument because I was like, I just need an outlet. It's called a guitar-lele. It is a hybrid of a guitar and a ukulele. So it's a little bit bigger than a ukulele, but it's got 6 strings, so it sounds a little bit thicker and heavier than the thinness of a ukulele. And again, we don't know how long this is going to go on. I have one client that's doing Code Academy, learning how to program video games. I have others that are doing gardening. I have several clients, teenagers, that have taken up cooking. It's giving them something in a lot of ways to focus on, that pays attention, that has a lot of mindfulness, because the greatest thing that will help your brain detach from uncertainty and stress is something to stimulate it. Stimulate's not always pleasure, but it's something that requires their focus. The greatest way to unplug from stress and anxiety is to plug it into something else, which is why something new and novel is really important. Right now, you have a lot of teens that are stressed, and so what they do is like, okay, I'm stressed, let me go onto my social media, or let me play video games. Here's the problem, or let me get on YouTube. The problem is they've logged in hundreds of hours on that, and their brain is so adapted to it that they can be on social media and still be stressed and worried and thinking about these other things. That's not even to mention whether or not what they're seeing on social media is contributing, participating to that stress. So we need novelty. We need something new, something that requires our attention. And even if it's only for a few months, it's going to be worth it. It's going to help provide some type of distraction, positive distraction to young people. So, you know, when we talk about expectations, we talk about that cognitive resetting stuff. What we want to do is be able to understand the difference between a grounding technique, which is sort of mindfulness, and an intervention, because it's all about what we can control. Somebody's stressed about something. Your teen, maybe you're anxious, you're stressed, you're worried. So what we ask ourselves first and foremost is it something that you have any control over? And if the answer is yes, well then employ some type of behavioral intervention. You know, this is something that I've been teaching young people long before the pandemic. I'm really stressed that my friend's upset with me. Well, what can you do about that? I could ask them, you know, and what if they are? I could apologize. Versus I'm really stressed about something, but you do nothing about it, but you stay in this constant state of stress and worry. You know, but if what they're stressed about right now, what they're worried about, they can't do anything about it. They have no power. It's all in the future. It's somebody else's decision, or we're in this global wait and see state. That's really when we shift to more of a mindfulness and a grounding. Okay, well then what can you focus on that you do have some control over? Because when we feel control, we feel empowered. Absence of control makes us feel small, makes us feel inadequate, and that's oftentimes when we may emotionally react in a really poor way. So we really need to, in this time of uncertainty, focus on what we can control. And usually when we're really worried and anxious, that's the first question that we ask. What are you anxious about? And sometimes people just need to talk with someone to figure that out. But even if they're able to identify it, the next question really is going to determine the path moving forward. Is there anything you can do about it? Or is that something that's out of your control?
Jonathan, it looks like Doug Powell has a question for us.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe.
I actually don't. I just pushed the button accidentally.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. I saw the button come up that says Doug raises his hand. I thought you were looking at it.
I wanted to be the first person to make that mistake so everybody else can now feel good.
Thank you, Doug. That's very kind of you.
Well, let me wrap up actually, because I have about 5 more minutes, and then I really want to open this up for questions, comments, other things. I am a big believer, more than ever, of 1 or 2 therapeutic interventions for everybody. One would be talking with somebody, talking with a professional. Not everybody is maybe as comfortable doing that. Maybe not everybody has the means to do that. But I tend to lump two coping devices together to help anybody when they are stressed, when they're overwhelmed, when they're living in times of uncertainty. It's either talking to somebody or journaling and writing out your thoughts. Here's the great thing about both of those. Both of those require that you organize your thoughts and slow down your thoughts, because we cannot talk as fast as our thoughts and our emotions and our memories kind of are circulating. And a lot of times they're ricocheting and it's all kind of muddled together and entangled. In order to talk, we have to slow down our thoughts. We have to come up with something that's coherent, and then we have to build off of that statement. By doing that, we organize our thoughts, we slow down our thoughts, and it helps us oftentimes feel grounded. Think of all the times you've talked with somebody. They didn't give you any advice. They just listened and allowed you to kind of untangle and externalize all that restless, anxious emotion in your thoughts and feelings. It's the same thing with journaling. You cannot write as fast as you think. So when we journal, it requires us to slow down our thoughts, organize our thoughts. When people get stressed and overwhelmed, their minds race and it becomes entangled and it escalates itself. So as we are fraught with a lot of anxiety and stress, talking with people, whether it's a mental health professional, whether it's a youth pastor, whether it's a youth volunteer, or journaling, writing out your thoughts, is a huge thing, because here's some of the stuff we want to start to really identify, monitor, and challenge when we are making assumptions. This is a big one right now. When we catastrophize, we assume the worst. When we only fixate on the negative. When we operate in all or nothing, black or white thinking. Here's a big thing for parents we do a lot. We're mind reading. We make assumptions about our kids, right? With that frustration, tolerance, and that irritability, young people are struggling a lot with personalization. They take things so personally, even though it has nothing to do with them. A lot of people struggle with what we call the shoulds and perfectionism, worrying that things aren't just right. If I make a small, tiny mistake, things are gonna fall apart. We're seeing that a lot right now with teenagers with SATs, going in as a senior, going in as college, all of these challenges, these new way of learning, and they're worried about what it's gonna really mean about their academic readiness. And we certainly want to be mindful of the intolerance of uncertainty, because that's gonna eat away at young people right now. Because if anything, we've moved into an era of great and ongoing uncertainty. So what does that mean for you all as family? It begins and ends with communication. Prioritize self-care for you guys and your kids. Talk often, be honest. Now, talking and communicating also means listening. I know we tend to forget that. And a lot of times we as parents struggle because we talk to our kids, they don't give us much back. And we tend to be a little uncomfortable with that silence. So then we overtalk and fill the space, and we never really nurture that shift to where mom and dad can shut up and our young people can grow into talking. Now, some of you don't have that problem with your kids, but some of you struggle to actually get them to say anything more than a haiku. Clarify roles and needs. What's different now? Carve out your own space, respect boundaries, adjust boundaries. Schedule time together, but really respect time alone. Prioritize kindness, compassion, and empathy, right? It begins and ends with us. We model that. You know, at this point, it's really a lot of what we do that our kids are really making note of. And that's important to recognize, because it also means that our words don't always matter as much because they're tuning it out. Or at this point, they've heard you say what you are saying 5,000 times. So they're actually not listening to you. They're actually in their mind mocking you. And they always tend to give parents a real negative voice in their head. Like, we never sound cooler in our kids' heads, right? I have this one client, they're in their late 20s, but whenever they talk about their mother, they switch into this shrill kind of voice. And I'm like, that must be awful to have a mother with a voice like that. But that's what they tend to do. Be flexible and adaptable. Simple as that, right? It's easier said than done. We were already struggling with this. We need to really be mindful of it just as much, if not more than ever. We got to find times when we unplug. We've got to unplug. If your kids' primary interests are online, they're spending all day online learning, and then all they do is switch to online stimulation and enjoyment. We have got to find a way to bring better balance into that. And then anytime we find ourselves in periods of great uncertainty, we have to remind ourselves we have got to avoid sweating the small stuff. Because, right, we have to ask ourselves, is this something that's not a big deal? And if it is, and you find yourself kind of reacting to it at a more intense level than really the offense is, then we have to find a way to outlet that frustration so that whatever response we have for a little thing stays little, right? Well, I'm going to open this up because I'm sure there's a lot of very specific questions that's just really difficult to answer or to insert into a presentation in 45, 50 minutes. But I really want to hear from you all what questions you have, either anything that I mentioned or anything that really I didn't address here today. And I don't know, Adrian, if you have a way that you want to kind of facilitate that or not.
I'm just open for anybody who wants to ask a question to feel free and jump in and ask a question. Vanderwells, go ahead.
So I'm going to be the first one. You know, I don't even really know what my question is, other than, you know, I feel like, you know, at least our daughters, 14 and 12, Jonathan, like are exhibiting things that they have never exhibited before. Like our middle child, like wouldn't cry for the life of her. And they were in tears both Monday and Tuesday night, just crying because of the situation that they're in. And as a parent, you know, I guess I would wonder, I mean, I just listen to him, but like, how would you help us like talk to them in regards to their worries like that, their worries with pressures of school? I've got a rising freshman, and just their worries of not being around their friends. Like, how can we as parents talk to them?
Sure.
And that would be a kind of question.
Yeah, whew, 2 daughters, been in that trenches. I have a rising freshman and a rising senior. Well, let me share with you an occupational hazard that I have, that over time I've learned the hard way to stop doing, mostly because it's ineffective and it's unwanted. They don't want me to fix it. They just want me to listen and empathize. They want me to acknowledge that I hear them, and yes, it's hard. Yes, it's hard. And when there are times of great uncertainty and we have very little control, here's one of the devices and tools I use a lot in family therapy. I use it a lot in marital therapy. Sometimes we can't make things better, but we can always make things worse. We can always make things worse. So in that instant with your daughter, that just you're recognizing there's these emotional meltdowns that are really rare. We haven't seen this. It's, you know, what's wrong? Can I help? Is there anything I can do to help? Can I circle back later and just check in on you about that? And then we oftentimes give what we describe as invitations. If you want to talk with me, I really want to listen. If not me, you know, I hope you can think of somebody that you could talk to. If you ever want to talk to somebody like a professional that, you know, that is their role is designed to help somebody, let me know. And you may not be surprised, but this generation, a lot of them are really good at self-advocating. But sometimes when they're just so overwhelmed in the emotions, it's really hard to verbalize and articulate what they think they need. So a lot of times what you'll see more is like, if we try to offer other things, they'll reject it. They'll swat it away because they know in their mind more of what won't help than maybe what would. And so really empathize, make yourself available, encourage them to be talking, or somebody that they could see themselves opening up to, and make the invitation. If they ever want to talk with somebody, it's there. And even if your daughter doesn't respond or accept that invitation then and there, you might be surprised several days, weeks down the road, where we have plenty of young people say, you know, you mentioned this back then, I think I would. So sometimes they just need to sit with what they have at their disposal that might be helpful. But if she is, you know, as much as she can articulate, if she's just sad and upset because the world is the way that it is, the biggest misstep parents can do is to try to fix or make them feel better, because that's a real emotion and we really want to validate their emotions. Yeah, this sucks. I'm sorry. You know, and we have a data point that, because I know what it's like to be that age and not have this, and to be able to go to school and be able to play sports and be able to go to football games or be able to go to these clubs. And so don't try to fix, listen and empathize, make yourself available. At any point, if you start to see more behavioral symptoms that suggest that it's really kind of like swallowing them, then that's when, as a parent, you oftentimes intervene and you talk to somebody specifically, a professional, and say, this is what's happening with my kid. I think maybe they need to speak to someone. And then maybe you go in a little bit more firm as a parent instead of inviting them to say, I think we need to. But that's, and I'll tell you, I've had just as many parents report what your daughter is exhibiting. So nobody is immune to it. Any other questions or thoughts?
My son is just started sixth grade, and that's overwhelming in and of itself, much less online. And he has 6 Zoom classes a day, and that has been overwhelming. I had to order blue light glasses and all that. What is the best way to handle all of the screen time? And well, and not just screen time, but the live interaction via computer. That's been the most overwhelming thing for him this past week.
Sure. You know, one of the challenges is right now, because a lot of people are doing school in their rooms, there's just a lot of natural distractions. So the more you can strip distractions away, and that can be tedious, but a lot of healthy living is tedious. A lot of healthy living is going the extra effort. Healthy living rarely has shortcuts. And so when you have a kid that's in their room, that they can be at their desk, but on their desk they have their switch charging. They may not pick up that switch, but what are they going to constantly be looking at and thinking about? That switch. If they have their graphic novels right next to there, they have their artistic notepad. Those are distractions in a platform that is already distracting. It's already detached and removed. Now, some people are kind of finding interventions around that they make kids learn outside of their room. And that's fine, but I'd rather it be collaborative and you and your son come up with a plan together. A lot of times right now in our house, we're utilizing small bins, but things can be just quickly moved and removed. Kids should not be doing any school in bed. They need to be at a desk. They need to be upright. The other thing that you can do is, just like a school day, you can identify multiple places to do your classes in breaks. So sometimes don't do 6 Zoom classes at your desk in your room. Do one at the dinner table. Do one on the counter, you know, and obviously not everybody has that luxury. So we try to be creative with what we have at our disposal. But some of those small things can make the big difference, even though early on, anytime you change something that requires effort, you're going to get pushback because it just means more work. But that's with everything. You know, if you see that initial pushback, these tools and interventions can help even just take their mind off so that they don't become this sort of like atrophied, numb 6th grader in front of a screen all day. The other thing that I would do is make sure when they're done with school that they get up and move. Now, if your kid likes video games, if he wants to get on YouTube, that's every parent's prerogative of how you monitor and the relationship technology has in your life, but don't have it be the very first thing. Give them a little bit of a buffer and detox. Have them go outside, give them some type of chore, walk the dog, have a snack downstairs where they don't bring any technology. Something to just kind of get some of those different parts of their body and their mind activated that it's really difficult during the day. What else? Anyone else?
Hey, Jonathan. I'm Stephen. We have also a 6th grader now, Elise, who's 11. And I guess one of the things we're noticing is that, we always were going to be the parents that we're going to wait till 8 for the phone. And we pretty much have, it's been a slippery slope, and she's even has her own number now. And part of that was she was riding her bike to a camp this summer. And so wanted to make sure she got there and everything with her younger brother. And so she's had to be more independent. But in any case, we're noticing that she is so much time on with school, on Zoom, and then, this is her way of staying in touch with her friends, but it seems to be, more, and as we try to put boundaries on that. I don't know. We're all kind of frustrated. And it's just trying to find balance there, because we want her to stay connected with friends, but we also want her to unplug. So any thoughts on that, on just balancing that? Because I kind of get her point and their need to, like, that's a way of staying in touch with friends. She has 2 neighborhood friends that she does stay kind of connected to, so they see each other some. But that's about it in terms of like actually seeing in person. So, you know, this is a way of staying in touch, but just trying to balance that, and, you know, see if you have any other thoughts.
Well, God bless you, right? Welcome to the club. Technology, your kids are going to want more than you give them. And part of that is that it is a social device, but it's also kind of this world and window of privacy. There's so much that they can access, or language or memes or other stuff, that we as parents just don't get necessarily, nor do we want to, right? At any point, anytime you instill boundaries that aren't there, what I was just mentioning a moment ago, there's going to be pushback. Your kid will always push back the status quo if the status quo is working for them. So if your kid has really unstructured access to technology and you suddenly implement a little bit more boundaries and limitations, they're not going to like it, right? So what we need to do is, just like I talked about earlier, we need to depersonalize that, not take things so personally that we see our kids do that. We as parents, we need to not be afraid of our kids being upset with us. If it's a principle and a value that you believe in, that is your role as a parent, to instill those in your kids. So what we need to do, though, is you don't get upset when they're upset with you. Don't expect them to like it. It's finding that balance that we walk away, because anytime there's change, there's pushback, but eventually a new normal becomes a new normal. Now, in this period of time, one of the things we want to do is you think about breaks. Some of this you can maybe attempt to do with your daughter and be collaborative, but you guys know your children's temperament better than I do, of how much this could be collaborative and participatory, and how much you just have to hand them a document and say, like, okay, this is what it is. Read it over. It's already been signed on your behalf. Certain curfews, breaks, right? And then in a lot of ways, really even use time. So when there's breaks, what can we do? You know, help them oftentimes if they get stuck, if they only think about, like, I won't have my phone, help that nurturing, that brainstorming, that creative thinking of, like, well, what are all the things? And then sometimes it falls on us to help, again, be a collaborator to make some of those things happen. We've had to do here recently a lot more of, like, driving one of our daughters to see a couple friends that we all feel comfortable with how those families are social distancing. Later tonight here, when I'm done with this, I get to go drive 45 minutes to pick them up. But if we're worrying about that lack and absence of human interaction, we as parents probably need to go a little bit above and beyond to make those happen now, especially if your kid cannot drive. It's Sunday night. I don't want to drive 45 minutes to go get my daughter. But what's the alternative? The alternative would be they didn't interact with anybody for how long? And then if your child goes to school that's remote, how long will it be again? Those small, even if they're in the backyard. And when that happens, you know, we've always tried to make our home the fun house, because what we were like is, like, we know what is and is not at our house, and our kids know what the expectations are at our house. So we want to be the fun place where they can be. But when they're there, we would say, hey, when your friends are here, put your phone over there, because make the most of this time with these friends here. You can implement breaks and stuff. When I was growing up, there were times when I couldn't be on the TV. There was times when the phone, which we had one phone, by the way, in our house, and it was mounted on a wall. And it had a really long cord, but, you know, there were times when if someone called, like, I would say, I can't talk right now. Like, we would be polite about it, wouldn't let it ring. So, but again, anytime you implement new boundaries, expect pushback. Don't take it personal. Don't expect them to like it though. And you find that middle ground where if we wait it out, hopefully things shift from a change of status quo to the new normal. If you ever have to get, more creative, there's always an appropriate level of incentive and consequences. Okay, well then let's make an arrangement. That's what we would call a win-win. Can you sweeten the deal? And then at a certain point, if that doesn't work, which we've done this with my daughters, at a certain point, if it doesn't work and they become belligerent or hostile, then they risk consequences because I'm willing to listen and be agreeable. But at the end of the day, I have all the power. I mean, I would never do this, but like, I could take away that phone. I could smash that phone. I could give that phone away. There's nothing they could do about it. I'm not going to abuse that power, but depending upon how much your daughter is willing to participate and respect you guys, that usually is the amount of that you afford that collaborative nature. Because at the end of the day, more the household right now, the more that is agreeable versus hostile, everybody wins. So, and I have, maybe this is another, I think I've given this talk at your guys' place before. Maybe, if you have a sixth grader, I have a whole tech talk, which I'm rewriting as we speak because the world has changed with our relationship with technology. But that is certainly one of the biggest worries that parents and administrators have about, and pediatricians have about these young people is, and I have a healthy relationship with technology, I'd like to think, but today is Sunday, so my iPhone lets me know how much time I spent on it. And this past week, I was on my phone an average of 12 hours a day. I don't know how, but apparently I was. But I guess that's just what's happened when we're constantly communicating with kids and people. Here's the other thing that we've always stressed in our household. If you need to talk to one of us, go find us, don't text us. That small little thing. When you're in house, don't yell, don't text, use those beautiful things God gave us called feet and go find the person and talk to them.
I have a question. So we have a college freshman who's supposed to be living on her own starting this week or last week and totally independent, and now she's home. So how do you recommend we kind of find that balance between doing like a high school senior where she's got a strict schedule and then we're in charge of everything versus a freshman where she's in charge of everything? How do we find that balance in terms of boundaries?
But she is in our home, so we need her to respect us too. So we're trying to find that balance.
Sure. Well, I think it's going to be some ongoing conversations, and this is a challenge. I work with families and high school seniors and college students for a whole year leading up to going to college in terms of, or if they're coming back because they had a bad experience, like how do we live together? But there's a few starting principles. One, as you just mentioned, they're living here, they need to assimilate into the family life. That's where you start because that's really where that is a healthy life skill. They were going to have to do that with their roommate. They were going to have to do that on their dorm floor. And so that's nothing about sort of, regressing in terms of young adulthood. We need to have some expectations and clarity versus not have them. And we get upset and the other person wasn't aware of something. And then that is what we call avoidable conflict. When it comes to like schoolwork or what they're doing, in a lot of ways, I think that's a conversation to have as well. But the best thing that you guys are going to do, unless your daughter says otherwise, is to err on, we need to really watch how much we're just monitoring and paying attention, because part of college is developing that intrinsic motivation and that self-direction versus mom and dad being really aware and over the course of several weeks just chiming in on things that we observe and notice. Parents, we all have PhDs in giving unsolicited advice to our kids. And so one of the things that I would strongly encourage you is to really work on biting your tongue. Say that you're there, that you're available, but one of the things that's going to help your daughter not be as miserable about a change that was out of her control, nobody wants, is not just, I can't go to my college, it's also, and I have to live with my parents, because that was part of the sweet deal. but you guys can really reduce some of that interaction, observing, monitoring, speaking. I think it's really appropriate if there are certain concerns, or you ever feel like your daughter, in terms of the house rules or integration, she's maybe being a little bit loose on that. I think it's healthy and appropriate to have specific check-in times, but usually we schedule those so nobody ever feels ambushed, things along those lines, because you guys are learning this as you go. She's learning this as you go. I don't expect either of you to have it figured out, but the house rules, sound, curfew, things along those lines, I think that's really, yes, that's where you start. But then when she's studying, how she's doing stuff like that, that's going to be a really big shift. If you struggle with that, you're really reducing and eliminating one of the biggest pieces of independent living that comes with college, that intrinsic motivation. It's in emotional intelligence, it's what we call self-management. We want to have mom and dad become less of a manager of these things. And just that small little advice, like that noticing something, we feel like it doesn't make a difference, but it can make a big difference. So, because we also don't want them avoiding us, because like, what's mom and dad going to say? So.
Is that something we should work on with our younger daughter, just reducing how much our input of noticing the little things and giving them, as they go through high school, giving them a little more freedom and a little less of that input?
I would have a talk with her, but I tend to lean on yes. I don't see middle schoolers, but I go to middle schools and I talk to all the parents. Let your kids fail then. If they're going to fail, let them fail then. It's cheap. They have a greater ability to sort of rebound because it doesn't really collapse their sense of self. But you would be surprised at how many college students don't make it through the first month of college because they don't have the self-management skills. They have over-relied on the external reinforcement, including school administration that are nice, but give too much extra credit, keep parents in the loop, parents reminding them, parents looking at Power School. You realize that only 43% of college students ever graduate from college. And so you have more that don't. You only have 38% that graduate in 4 years. And you have close to 30% that don't go back after their first year. Why? It's not academics. It's this adulting, these small things that parents in our community does for them because we want them to do it instead of, but can they generate that themselves? I go to middle schools and I say, start this now, and maybe you won't see me in high school or in college. When I had one client that his first semester of college got a 0.00 GPA. And the school and his parents somehow allowed him to go back and retake all those classes. And his second semester, he got a 0.0 GPA. I've had one kid that didn't last 1 week at college. My busiest time of the month is October because that's when people take medical withdrawals before they get failing grades on their first semester transcripts at college. Adulting, the earlier you can start, the better. What's the worst thing in the world if your kid flunks math in middle school? They're going to learn. You need to put more effort into math versus if you start then, you trap yourself in that cycle of I now am their reinforcer. Are you going to go to college with them? So start now, start young.
And Alfred, Catherine, I would recommend you guys host the Greek life party at your house this coming week. Have the sorority over, maybe the frat house out the garage. Really give her the college experience.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry, Adrian. I missed all of that.
Absolutely. Toga time.
Yes.
Any other questions? Well, listen,
Oh,
go ahead.
John, sorry. Hey, this is Carolyn. I have one quick question. You mentioned mindfulness. Do you have any resources for like the middle school crowd that would be helpful around mindfulness exercises?
Sure. The great thing with mindfulness, and this may be a little bit of a mixed message depending upon your kid's relationship with technology. But there's so many great apps for kids to help manage anxiety, create calm. For young kids, and I can send this resource to Adrian, it's a PDF. For children, there's an app called Stop, Breathe, and Think. There's an app called Dreamy Kid. For teens and young adults, there's the Stop, Breathe, and Think. There's the Smiling Mind. We have Headspace. We have Calm. For teens and adults, there's an app called Mind Shift. The great thing, a lot of these, including like Headspace or Calm, is they recognize that if people are using an app, we generally are starting off really, really bad at mindfulness. So they do a developmental step model, which means like practice for a minute, practice for a couple minutes, get into that habit. It can sync if they have an Apple Watch. It can sync if they have other things where it reminds them, like stop and breathe. Those types of things. Some of these apps really can create community too, so they can stay in touch with their peers. And how are we doing with stopping and breathing and tapping into our mindfulness? And so again, the more you can build community, and if mom tries to tell our child to use this, they may be like, ah. But if they and a couple of friends kind of make this, something that they're reinforcing through peer support, then by all means. I need to track down one app. I don't know if it's still heavily utilized, but there was one app that used healthy living as a game. Like you would power up and you'd reach certain criterias and get certain sort of like rewards. And they structured it in a way that a lot of young people with video games, it would really resonate with them in terms of like how many steps, or did you do exercise or deep breathing or stuff like that. And you would tabulate points. So, but I will send that to Adrian. And I always recommend, the other is like most apps, I would recommend then, if you're really encouraging it for your kids, use it yourself, become familiarized with it. The more you're an expert with something, the more we practice what we preach. And not all the time, but there's a great number of times that feels less like sort of like overly parenting when we ask or encourage or direct our kids to do something that we ourselves aren't willing to do ourselves. So.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Questions, comments, complaints?
Jonathan, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We are all living into this new normal. It is difficult for us to figure out how to react for our children, because at times we're trying to figure out how we need to react. And so it's important to try to figure out and be mindful of all of that good stuff. So thank you for your time and helping us to unpack it.
Absolutely. And what I will do is I will send you, Adrian, I kind of have a PowerPoint that goes over a lot of these principles. I'll convert it to a PDF. You guys can have it available. It's got my email on it. If you ever need to follow up, ask any types of questions, something more specific or personal, maybe a Zoom platform wasn't maybe the most comfortable for you. And then I will send some of those checklists and then the app resource as well. So hopefully, hopefully something today, you can walk away with something that hopefully you might be able to be helpful or integrate into your family life.
Thank you again.